What's up, APUSH peeps? We have chapter 6 of Give Me Liberty for you today. This is from the 4th edition, but if you have other editions, it'll match up as well, so let's get going. All right, we're going to start off with democratizing freedom and expanding the political nation. After the revolution, men still had control over their household, wives, and slaves. Now, keep in mind, a lot of these ideas of freedom and equality that are going to be talked about are not going to extend to women and slaves. That's a theme of this chapter. Now let's talk about the meanings of democracy. It's a couple of different variations. It could mean that the whole population voted, but this would lead to a fear of a mob rule, which was a common theme of early American history. After the revolution, it came to mean greater equality, but really it was just for white men, not for women and African Americans. Artisans and small farmers, they began discussing politics, not just elites, so it was really a large variety of Americans who partook in political discussion. Let's jump over to Pennsylvania. In early 1776, on the eve of the Revolution, it was really divided into two different camps, pro-British and pro-independence. The leaders of the pro-independence movement included names that you're familiar with, such as Thomas Paine, T-Paine, here we go, Benjamin Rush, and many others, and they're the ones that really win out. In the newly created Pennsylvania State Constitution, created a unicameral or a one-house legislature with no governor, and it also eliminated property requirements for office holding. So we see the impacts of the British government here, this idea of a unicameral legislature with no governor, this fear of an executive branch. And that'll be something we'll get into in the next chapter with the Articles of Confederation. Other states are going to create constitutions, and many Americans believe that governments should be republics. In other words, people vote, and they are the ultimate authority. They get to vote for office holders who would represent them. John Adams, second president of the United States, he's going to argue for balanced governments in states, and when he talked about that, he envisioned a bicameral legislature, which is a two-house legislature that represented the wealthy and ordinary Americans. He also saw a governorship and a judiciary branch that would help provide balance. So this idea of really three separate branches he envisioned. Southern states were the least democratic out of all the states. And for example, in Virginia and South Carolina, the governor was chosen by the legislature, which was controlled by the wealthy. So it wasn't the people who got to vote for the governor. It was members of the legislature who tended to be the wealthy individuals. The state of Vermont will see no property requirements nor poll taxes to vote. So that will be one of the first states to really eliminate property requirements for voting. And in New Jersey, women could vote if they owned property up until 1807. So widowed women, for example, who inherited property from their husbands, they would be able to vote. And all states except South Carolina held annual elections. And holding annual elections would make office holders more accountable to the voters because they could vote them out of office if they were unhappy. Let's jump on over to religion now, and let's talk about Catholic Americans. During the Revolutionary War, Americans worked more with Catholics. Look no further than the French alliance, and France was a Catholic nation. So for the first time, Americans work hand in hand with Catholics and begin to see Catholics as not as much of a threat. Although there still will be lots of hostility towards Catholics, it begins to decrease slowly. The Scots-Irish and the Virginia frontier, they sought to end taxes that supported the Anglican Church, and this will really be a continuing movement for other states as well. And many founding fathers were deists. And if you're a deist, you pretty much believe that God created the world and then stepped back. There's no divine intervention. God is not siding with an individual or group of people. God created the world and then basically took a hands-off approach. And he created what is known as the Jefferson Bible. And you can see this in the Smithsonian. The Jefferson Bible is basically the Christian Bible, but it removed all references to Jesus being divine. So he thought Jesus was a really good person, a very moral person, but he did not believe that Jesus was divine. Jefferson was also quoted as saying that he envisioned a wall of separation between government and religion. And we see that states begin to eliminate established churches, and especially state-supported taxes towards these churches. Many state constitutions promoted this idea of free exercise of religion, and all states except New York barred Jews from participating in politics. So there still was discrimination against other religions besides Christianity. Jefferson was the author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which is a forerunner to the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of religion. If you take a look at his grave, you can go and see it. It says, "Here lies Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." Those are what he considered to be the three most important milestones of his career. What is missing? Oh yeah, being president. He didn't think I ranked in the top three. James Madison, a good friend of Thomas Jefferson, he viewed America as an asylum to the persecuted. This is kind of continuing the idea of American exceptionalism that we talked about in the last chapter. So with the American Revolution, some churches would see new ideas that challenge tradition in their churches as well. You have the Young Moravians in North Carolina. They challenged arranged marriages and some of the traditional ideas in their church. And new religious denominations emerged and would really continue to emerge throughout American history. Today, we have about 1,300 different religious denominations in the United States today. So during the American Revolution, people began to question church as well, and we see the emergence of new denominations. Christian republicanism is this idea that Christianity is good to instill moral values, moral qualities and values into citizens. And then we see the emergence of support for free public schools. And the question is why? People like Thomas Jefferson love the idea of free public schools. And this is because he believed, and many others believed, that an educated electorate is very important because one day they would be voting and making decisions for the country. So it's important to have an educated group of Americans who will one day be making decisions. By 1800, there are virtually no indentured servants in the United States. So that draws more of a line between slaves and free individuals. The North relied on free labor, which meant that people could work for wages. Noah Webster viewed equality as the most important right an individual could have, more than freedom of speech, more than freedom of religion, you name it, he thought equality was the most important. And Americans really favored equal opportunity, but not necessarily equality of condition. In other words, everybody should have an equal opportunity to obtain something, but it doesn't mean that everybody should obtain the exact same thing or be guaranteed to obtain the exact same thing. Jefferson favored a small government, but he believed that the government should help promote freedom. So this limited government should not infringe on people's rights, but the government should help protect freedom and promote freedom for Americans. In Virginia, they abolished entail, which forbid the division of land upon a person's death beyond the family. This idea of entailment, if I own a large plantation and I die, my heirs could not break that up and sell it. It had to be intact as a whole. This is outlawed, and this helps more people acquire land. And Virginia also abolished primogeniture, which is the idea that the eldest son inherits all the property. So if I have 6 children, my eldest son is not going to be the only one who benefits from my passing by gaining all of my land. During the Revolutionary War, prices of goods soared and paper money was being printed at a very high rate. Crowds would sometimes seize food and other goods from stores, and then they would sell it at a price that they saw fit. And Congress set up and established price wages, and we'll see this a couple times throughout American history. And they sought to do this to promote the benefit for the public good. So the government is kind of getting involved here to promote the public good, not necessarily for individuals. However, shortly after, the government price regulations would stop, and this really kind of represents this conflict between promoting the public good versus economic freedom for individuals. All right, let's jump on over to loyalists. These were people who were loyal to Britain during the Revolutionary War. They made up roughly 20% of the American population, depending on where they were. Many tenants and slaves of large plantations sided with the British during the war, and they did so in the hopes of gaining freedom or gaining land. And newspapers that were loyal to Britain in the colonies in America were suppressed and often shut down. Quakers and other pacifists, they were arrested for not fighting, and they lost property, and in many cases they did not get it back. And residents in many states were required to take oaths, or they would lose the right to vote. So you really had to be very pro-patriot during the Revolutionary War, or you would face obstacles. 60,000 loyalists left the United States after the war, and that helped lead to the creation of New Brunswick in Canada that was made up of many loyalists. And those that remained in the United States eventually became a part of society, but they did not receive their confiscated property back as they were promised in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which ended the Revolutionary War. Now, Native Americans were drastically impacted by the Revolutionary War. Americans, as we know, they sought to expand before and after the war. They sought to expand so much so that the British issued the Proclamation Line, which forbid expansion. And natives themselves were divided in the support during the war, and many of them did side with the British, including this famous Native American, Joseph Brant. And native land was destroyed in conflicts with Americans during the Revolutionary War. Many Americans sought land that belonged to natives, and the government did support this. Jefferson, in particular, he was in favor of this because he envisioned an agrarian society for America. And out west is where a lot of Native Americans were living on land that could be part of this agrarian vision. He believed that Native Americans should move west of the Mississippi, and this idea would be fulfilled in part under Andrew Jackson with the Indian Removal Act, in which many Native Americans were forced to move west of the Mississippi River over to Oklahoma. And natives were left out of the Treaty of Paris of 1783. There was no protection for them. There was no land set aside for them. The British essentially left them out on their own to deal with this newly created American government. Now, when we're talking about arguments for independence, many people argued that colonists were enslaved because they couldn't vote in Parliament. That's really an awful way to use the word enslaved, because you didn't have a political voice. James Otis, he was one of the few writers that argued that blacks were British subjects as well and should be treated as such. And those that cried for freedom the loudest often owned slaves. So you would see these large plantation owners upset with the British, and they would be the ones that and claim that they did not have freedom, and they would be the ones that owned slaves. More than 40% of the populations of Virginia, Georgia, and South Carolina were made up of slaves, so a very large portion of the population. Most founding fathers owned slaves, including Jefferson and Washington, among many others. And slave owners advocated or believed that the government should protect property, including slaves. This is going to be a key idea about government. Many people believe it is the government's responsibility to protect property. And many people during this time believed that slaves were a property and the government should protect it. Quakers, that we know from William Penn, settled in Pennsylvania. They were early abolitionists, one of the few groups that were outspoken from a very early time. But the famous American Benjamin Rush, he really predicted the future when he argued that slavery would bring national punishment and that would ultimately become true during the Civil War. So the question is, why was slavery accepted in governments, especially the Constitution? Now, I know I'm jumping ahead by about a chapter here, but it's important to understand this, that if people tried to outlaw slavery, many individuals in the South would not support this. So in order to have a unified nation, slavery was accepted in both state governments and the federal or the national government as well. Not surprisingly at all, many slaves began to use the same ideas and arguments of the Revolutionary era to try to obtain their freedom. They instituted freedom petitions, which were introduced into courts by slaves to seek freedom, and many slaves did not achieve their freedom. Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and James Madison, all of them had slaves flee to the British side during the war, and all told about 100,000 slaves in the U.S. did the exact same thing. They fled to the British, fought on behalf of the British, because the British gave a declaration that slaves would become free if they fought on their behalf. In 1827, many years later, Britain compensated some slave owners for this, so they paid them money for their slaves fleeing. And some slave owners in the Chesapeake emancipated their slaves in the 1780s, some as a result of fighting and for other reasons as well. Now, really quick, what two colonies made up the Chesapeake? Virginia and Maryland. Very good. What type of labor did they use initially? Yep, indentured servitude, and they switched to slavery after what rebellion? You got it, Bacon's Rebellion. And what was the major crop they grew? Yep, you interrupted me. That's good. Tobacco. And the further this out, the less likely it was to occur. Now, in 1777, Vermont banned slavery in the state, and most emancipation laws in the North were gradual, and this idea that children of slaves would be free once they reached a certain age of adulthood, sometimes as late as 25. So when you hear about emancipation laws, it doesn't necessarily mean that all slaves were guaranteed freedom or became free. Usually it was children of slaves. In the 1830s, there were still some slaves that lived in the North. Now, abolition in the North created a division between free and slave states. So we really see like Ohio, Pennsylvania here. This will be the northern states that are free, and below it will be South. And this division, keep in mind when we get to the Missouri Compromise in a few chapters from now, we'll see this line, this 36 degrees 30 north latitude line. This really will create a division, a geographical division between North and South, or between slave and free states. And that will create a lot of tension in the United States. Many states allowed free blacks who met financial qualifications to vote, but that did not extend to Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. Again, those states that had slaves make up a lot of their population. All right, we'll finish up talking about women. Deborah Sampson, she was a famous woman who disguised herself as a man and fought during the Revolutionary War. Many women contributed to the war effort through various ways, including the homespun movement by providing clothing, passing information along to Americans, and also by providing medical treatment. Equality did not, I repeat, did not extend to women after the Revolution. As I mentioned earlier to begin this chapter, husbands still had legal authority over their wives, and the expectation was that women would be obedient to their husbands above all else. Now, Republican motherhood, you have to know this at start. It's wicked, wicked important. Make sure you understand this. This idea really emerges during the Revolutionary era. And it's the idea that women were expected to raise children to be good citizens. So it really placed an increased importance on women in the home and the belief that they would raise children to be good American citizens. This did allow for increased education opportunities for women, but it did not extend to the political realm at all. And unlike slavery, women's rights did not become a major topic until years later, particularly in the mid-19th century at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, but I'm jumping ahead. We'll get to it in a few chapters. The American Revolution had tremendous impact on the world. Very important to know. It's this idea that the American Revolution inspired other revolutions, including in France, Haiti, and Latin America. So many other people looked at the Declaration of Independence and said, you know what? That makes sense. Let's apply that to our country. If we have a king here, we're going to overthrow that king, or at least try to. All right, let's do a quick recap. State governments under the new constitutions, know how they were set up, what was the purpose of them. Religion, what is deism? Definitely know Jefferson's wall of separation. Loyalists during the war, how many were there? What happened to them? Native Americans during the war, what was the impact on them? And gradual emancipation, what does that mean? And women in the Revolutionary War. And finally, of course, Republican motherhood, know that at all costs. All right, guys, look forward to seeing you right back here for Chapter 7, where we'll talk about a very famous rebellion that is depicted here. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. I thank you guys very much for watching, and have a good day.